on the app, on your smart speaker, Talk Radio and Talk TV.
Hello and a very good morning to you. It is Petri here with you until 1 o'clock. That's about 15 minutes time. Different programme this morning, you may have noticed if you're listening, and that is because we're not on the television. Back to normal, though, tomorrow at midnight. So, NATO, there's a meeting taking place hours away now from a high-profile annual summit of NATO members. Now, this is very much being seen as a stress test for the alliance. With Russian President Vladimir Putin clearly going to be watching very closely as to what is announced with regards to Ukraine. It doesn't seem like much more than the status quo will be happening for Ukraine, as the American President Joe Biden, as we discussed earlier, has ruled out the fact that Ukraine can join NATO mid-war, that there would have to be some kind of ceasefire. But also, what would that mean for Russia? What would that mean for Moscow? And also, if we're saying that that Ukraine can't join NATO until after the war, surely that gives Russia an excuse to prolong the war. I'm just thinking out loud here. Someone who knows much better than I. Delighted to say that Jamil Jaffer joins me now, Executive Director at National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Jamil, such a pleasure to have you back. Thank you.
Petri, thanks for having me.
That is a question, though, isn't it? It just occurred to me that if Ukraine joining NATO is contingent on the war ending, that's why the war is happening, that Russia doesn't want Ukraine in the war. So there's no reason for Moscow to offer any kind of end to the war.
No, that's exactly right. It does prolong the war, but truth be told, the only reason we're even really talking seriously about NATO, Ukraine joining NATO at this point, is because of the war, because Russia unlawfully, illegally invaded Ukraine's territory for the second time, in 10 years. They've come in and illegally invaded this country. So, look, I think that it makes sense what the president was saying. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. Nobody, I think, seriously thought that bringing Ukraine into NATO during the conflict would make sense unless the allies were prepared, which they haven't been yet to date, to, in fact, go to war under Article 5, that mutual defense
Which they
agreement.
would have to, right? If once NATO was, once Ukraine was part of NATO, we'd all have to pile in.
Right, exactly right.
So, okay, what is going to appease Ukraine at this stage? Because, of course, obviously, Zelensky's saying, well, we want in now, right? And we don't want any of this fuss. We don't have to go all through all the paperwork. That is not going to happen. Palpably, that's not going to happen. But what would please Ukraine and Russia and the other NATO members?
Well, there's nothing that's going to please both Russia and Ukraine. Russia obviously has illegally invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has fought back bravely. They've done so with quite a bit of weaponry from the United States and the allies, including the UK, which has leaned forward perhaps more than any other ally, going first on F-16s, going first on major tanks. And so the UK really, in a lot of ways, has led. The US has provided a significant amount of weaponry, the majority of it coming from the United States, but the UK leaning forward the most. Now, what does Zelensky really want, and what does Zelensky need? It's what we've given him thus far and more. The F-16s aren't in the fight yet. The Challenger tanks and the M1A1 tanks aren't in the fight yet. The Leopards from the Germans are in. He needs more of that. Frankly, Petri, had we given him all of what we said we wouldn't give him before, we've ultimately given him, and we given it to him earlier on, HIMARS, 155 millimeter howitzers, M1A1s, F-16s, potentially now ATACMS, cluster bombs. All these things, had they been given to Ukraine before the war or in the early days of the war, we might have even staved it off, and we certainly could have ended it a lot faster.
Interesting we talk about that, because I want to pick up on the cluster bombs. I did, Joe Biden was here today. 100 countries, including the UK, have signed a treaty to say that cluster bombs won't be sold by them, they won't be stockpiled, they won't be given away, they won't be used. And yet Joe Biden is offering these highly contentious weapons to Ukraine, really in the face of of a lot of other countries, right? Because this convention has been signed by 100 countries, not Ukraine, not Russia, and not the US. It seems interesting to me that Joe Biden would step out and offer these bombs.
Well, a few things about the cluster bombs. One, these aren't the cluster bombs of the old days, which had about a 30% non-explosion rate. The concern about cluster bombs is they spread these small bomblets. Some of them aren't exploded. They lie on the ground and they kill civilians later on, much like landmines might. These cluster munitions, the ones that are being given to the Ukrainians, have a fail rate of about 2.35%. Now, any fail rate is still too much and can cause concerns about civilians, but 2.35 is a big difference from the prior 30% rate that caused a lot of people to be very concerned about these devices. Second, remember, these are Ukrainians using them on their own territory. So they have every incentive to protect their own civilians. They're going to take very close care of where these bombs are utilized, and they're going to go clean up the space afterwards once they've gotten rid of the Russians. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we need to do whatever it takes, Petri, to help the Ukrainians win this war, bring it to a rapid end. The Russians have engaged in attacks on civilians constantly, wantonly, rapes, murder. I mean, you name it, the Russians have violated every law of war. It's critical that the Ukrainians bring this conflict to a close as fast as possible.
But isn't that a race to the bottom? I completely understand, and I know war is not pretty. I've reported on war, so I know that it isn't the movies that we see. But cluster bombs, they cannot be controlled once they've been released, right? I mean, that is the other issue. It's not just the clear up rate. This is just like throwing confetti, heavy confetti, right? You don't control where those small bomblets end up. They're not controllable. So that it feels like there's this sort of Geneva Convention out the window. You know, everybody's just at it now until the end. Is that the price we're going to have to pay?
Well, you know, I'm not sure we're quite at that stage, but I understand what you're saying. You're right. 100 countries have banned it. And so this is obviously a concern. I will say that, you know, the Ukrainians are running out of artillery. Both the allies, the UK, the other allies, the United States doesn't have that much artillery to give them. The U.S. has 3 million of these artillery shells, these cluster bombs around. And so there is some value in making sure that these are utilized safely. Now, the Ukrainians have said they're going to be very careful. They're going to track them. You're right at some level that they spread over a certain area. They don't go anywhere. But you're right. They are dangerous, and that is why the U.S. has limited their use of them. We did use them in Iraq. We used them in the early days of Afghanistan. But the U.S. for a number of years has limited its use as well. And so you're right to raise these concerns, Petri. I don't mean to suggest that they're not concerns. But again, this is a war the Russians brought to the Ukrainians, illegally invading their country. It's time to end that war now to save more civilians.
While we're looking at the aid that we all give to Ukraine, one of the conversations during the NATO summit must be how long are we going to have the backing of our own civilians? Italy is certainly very concerned that the public are losing interest in funding an endless war in Ukraine, and I don't think there's the appetite for anybody to see Vietnam again, right? So how do we bring this to a conclusion? And NATO, in a sense, has got to find a way to bring this to a conclusion.
No, you're exactly right. And this war has gone on already much too long. It's well over a year and a half now about a year and a half this conflict has gone on. And the truth is, this conflict has gone on so long because, one, we didn't expect the Ukrainians to be as successful as they've been, as brave as they've been. And when we realized that they were this successful, we didn't give them everything. We have slowly eked out. We've slowly added a little bit more. You know, what we need to do is give them everything they need today, tomorrow, and let them take the fight to the Russians, push the Russians out as far as possible, force Vladimir Putin to negotiate an end. He will not, to your point, will not end this conflict on his own unless he's suffering significant casualties, much more than he's suffering today.
The other thing that NATO needs to discuss is what to do because there is no plan, as far as I'm aware, of what to do if Russia deploys nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Right? There's tactical nuclear weapons. NATO has had no discussion. I cannot believe that is the case, but it is. Surely they've got to come up with what they would do if Russia does that. We know what would happen if Russia aimed nuclear weapons somewhere else, but if you use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, there is no plan.
I think you're right. And I think it has to be clear to Vladimir Putin that any use of tactical nuclear weapons would result in an overwhelming response from the rest of the entire world, that the world would turn against him, the NATO allies in particular, and they would directly intervene in the conflict. That has to be clear. We cannot accept the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Look, there's been a lot of fear about that. He's bandied them about since the beginning of this conflict. A lot of times the allies and frankly the Biden White House has shied away from putting what they need to into the fight out of concern that it might provoke Vladimir Putin into using tactical nuclear weapons. It's clear that he hasn't done so thus far. And the fact of the matter is we've put in all those things we said we wouldn't because we were afraid of it. I think the time is now to bring the fight to Vladimir Putin and make clear to him as part of that, as we're bringing the fight to him, that the use of tactical nuclear weapons will turn the world against him, including the NATO alliance, and will result in an overwhelming defeat for the Russian military, pushing them completely out of Ukraine, including Crimea, and to not and decimate his military.
But the NATO have got to come up with a plan. They've not even written anything down on the back of a fag packet. You know, there isn't a response, and one is absolutely vital. Jamil, it's so fantastic to talk to you. It always is. I could do it for hours. Jamil Jaffer, thank you so much. Executive Director at the National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington, D.C.